I'm admitting everyone.
Javier?
Hello.
Hello?
Yeah.
Now I'm going to set Lloydie up. Okay, here you go.
Good.
Here I am.
I don't see you yet, Lloyd. Let's
Okay,
see.
hold on a second. Now.
Put on the...
Yes, we see you.
Oh, wonderful to see you too.
Oh, well. So bye-bye. Have fun.
Okay.
So, and if you need something, just call me, okay?
All right.
Big crowd today.
A little bit.
So welcome everyone to a workshop with Javier, who was with us already last year. We are very happy to have him back. He's been a long-time student of Krishnamurti's teaching and was chief editor of The Link, when a wonderful magazine that connected, that sort of explored different aspects of Krishnamurti's teaching. So we were very happy to have him back. And thank you all of you for joining us. Some of you are from Europe and someone even from Australia. So it's an international meeting. It's hosted by the Krishnamurti Center of Canada, which is located in Victoria in the west coast of Canada. And everything we do these days is online, but we also have a beautiful property center at on the shores of the Pacific. If you ever have the opportunity to visit us when we're open, that would be wonderful to see you there. There'll be a presentation by Javier, and then we'll open it up for questions and answers. I would suggest you raise your invisible hand if you have questions, and we'll take them then in order. But otherwise, you're also welcome to, if there's a moment, an opportunity to just ask questions without raising the hand. As long as things will flow reasonably smoothly, we hope. And well, I'm sure it'll all work out very well. So I look forward to you being with us and getting us started. Javier, go ahead.
Okay, thanks. I'm not sure it will come out well, but I'll do my best. As you can imagine, the subject we proposed, it's really very delicate. And in fact, there are so many questions about it. Nonetheless, it seemed to me important to look into it because there is such a depth of meaning in Krishnamurti's notebook. I took the notebook as a reference because to me, it's one of the great, I don't know what it is if you read it, I hope you have. If you haven't, I certainly recommend it. I think it's kind of Krishnamurti's quintessential work, in that it is himself writing a journal for a number of months from, let me see even the dates. He begins in sometime in 1961, June 1961. Yeah, June 20th. And there were two original editions. See, I happened to be at Brockwood as a student when Krishnamurti's notebook came out in 1976. And I made sure immediately to get a copy because it was from him. It was his own work. Most of the works that we read of Krishnamurti are transcriptions of his talks, edited versions of those talks. But this was him writing with his own, with a pencil apparently, directly on a notebook. That's why it's called a notebook. But it's a diary, it's a journal. And I made sure to get a copy. Apparently, they had hesitated to publish it because it contained a description. What Krishnamurti did was to describe his daily states of consciousness, the inner states of consciousness. As you may be very well aware, I'm sure, Krishnamurti's teachings try to address fundamentally. This is why he felt his job was to face us all, reflect, hold up a mirror to the disordered operation of human consciousness, how we are in our daily lives, and how our being, our lack of self-understanding, is responsible for the kinds of disorders, divisions, conflicts, sorrow that we normally experience. Why does the world not work? Why do our relationships fall apart? Why what we construct, what we build, falls down again? We're caught in a Sisyphean motion for which we're all responsible. So he's holding up that mirror, but of course that mirror is not only intended to bring about an order in our functioning, but in our being. And our being is relationship. And that relationship is not only with others, with things, with people, with nature, with ourselves internally, but reaches out into a unitary movement which includes a cosmic dimension. So Krishnamurti, as far as I understand it, was concerned with that totality and to make it actual by dissolving the factors of division that fragment our existence from one another, from ourselves, and from the cosmic dimension. So he was reflecting suddenly, bringing across this sense of what this implied. What happens to a consciousness, to a human being, when that sense of non-duality, non-divisiveness is there? Yeah, what happens? What happens? Can't he even function? Or is he always being knocked around by all these profound energies? Does God just pull his strings, if there is a God or whatever it is behind him? Or is there therefore a total excellence in functioning in his life? And therefore it's something that demonstrates the validity even of this search. Otherwise, why would we bother? So I was brought up as a Catholic, and I knew a little bit about mysticism. So I wasn't surprised by what I was reading, unlike some other people who seemed to be a bit put off. And in fact, as I said, they hesitated to publish it because they felt that it was going to give the world, most of the people interested in Krishnamurti, the impression that actually what he was describing was unattainable. He was describing his daily states of contact with a quality of energy that was totally other. That's what he called it, the other, the otherness, other than what we normally experience, other than the state of self-centered consciousness in which fragmentation predominates. But it seemed to me, therefore, that Krishnamurti, from the first moment I read him when I was a teenager, that he was a mystic. In the sense, the word mystic in English has a lot of meanings, yes, and one of them is just fantasist and illusionist, somebody who sort of is easily deluded by his own qualities of visionary qualities. But it seemed to me that there was, from our own Catholic tradition, as a matter of fact, from the Spanish mystics, there was a different meaning, which was the human being who, through a profound transformation in themselves or through self-knowledge, come upon a state of consciousness in which that union is possible. The union, what they called it, the divine, and so on. Krishnamurti initially also called it the great being, the Maitreya, and so on. They then started eliminating all these names and all these words and say, no, it's not a person, cannot be put into words, it's something of a different order. So the notebook as far as I'm concerned, is one of the great mystical works in which a mystic, and forgive me for using the word if you don't like it, but that's the meaning I put to it, okay? Just of a human being who really, actually has this access to the sacred dimension. Or the sacred dimension has access to him. Whichever way it goes, it doesn't really matter. But that quality of holiness, that quality of integrity, total, sacredness coming into life, which is the essence of the religious quest. There's a lot of issues as to whether the word religion has any meaning in our time. Well, that is inevitably so because history has brought it to a point of crisis. And the traditional religions have evidently failed to bring about any kind of ordered human existence. This profound quality of being, which would in turn transform society, make us truly cultured, truly good. As you are all aware, that's not happening. And that's not been happening. And our beliefs are small consolations for our lack of understanding. And just a way of comforting ourselves maybe with some hope, with some measure of ideological order in terms of what we should be, but which we aren't. And Krishnamurti is very drastic that way in disciplining us in the sense of saying, no, watch yourself, all boys and girls. It's your life where it's all playing out. So that implied a lot of issues in his own life because he was brought up by the Theosophists. And therefore, he was brought up specifically to be the new Messiah of our time, the great teacher, the great transmitter of truth for the beginning of a new civilization, of a new culture, because we were, according to them, in the age of the Kali Yuga, the destructive age, and certainly the 20th century, by Jove, if there was a destructive age, it was the 20th century. So it would be very nice to have a good teacher who somehow transmits the values, the wisdom, rather, that is necessary for humanity to proceed. So I had this notion that Krishnamurti was that, and therefore I was not particularly surprised to find what he was discovering. And yet there were a number of issues that this book raised, and that it still raises, and that are very challenging to look at. The whole transcendental element, of course, is challenging in itself, because for most of us, it may have happened occasionally. We may have been really out of ourselves. Fortunately, for a moment or two, I think those probably form the highlights of our existence. Moments when there was no duality, when we really were one with ourselves and with the world, and in fact, there was no sense of separation at all anywhere, and there was a sense of presence, a sense of immensity, a sense of goodness and beauty, which really transcended any kind of notions or sensations even that we might have acquired before. He's talking about that, and he's talking about that as a regular phenomenon in his own existence. Right? The first sentence, the first entry in the book is already puts you on a path saying this is something different. He said, the first entry is very short. I don't think he knew where he was going. In the evening, he was there. Suddenly, it was there, filling the room. A great sense of beauty, power and gentleness. Others noticed it. So there is something, a visitation that happens to him, and this is in every page practically, well, in every entry of this book. But there is another curious phenomenon that happens to him also on practically a daily basis, and that is what they called the process. The process. This was a word that Krishnamurti's brother, Nityananda, came up with when this whole peculiar experiences began for him in 1922 in Ohio. I think most of you probably are aware of all those descriptions. But I think it might be important still to go into it, because today I meant to go into that a little bit. Because when Krishnamurti was asked, why did you write a notebook? He gave this explanation, and he mentioned the process. Right? He says, I wrote it as a diary while I was traveling. He was going to New York. And it was not intended as a private, revealing document. Right? He wasn't talking about his life. I ate this, I talked to so-and-so. He wasn't doing that. I have a horror of that very personal sort of thing. My publisher was interested to put it into print, and that was all right with me. But I did not write it for publication. I describe what I call the process, my sensation of being outside the ordinary world, of being completely at peace and removed from conflict. This happens only from time to time, and clearly it is impossible to describe to anybody who has not experienced it. But I have attempted to put into words the actual pain and sensation which goes with a heightened consciousness. It is not intended in a romantic way. If you lead a certain type of disciplined, quiet life, you realize a kind of energy. That's scientific fact. And this affects the non-mechanical part of your brain, so that you enter into a new dimension. The physical organism is incapable of meeting it, and so you get the pain. I'm not suggesting that everyone should try to attain this, but it may be of interest to some people who have followed my thoughts and ideas to know what happens on a more personal level. So that was Krishnamurti's explanation to the newspaper reporter who interviewed him for a review of the book, of the notebook, when it was published. And he does give an explanation, or attempts an explanation, as to what it all involves, this process. It's his sensation of being outside the ordinary world, of being completely at peace and removed from conflict. This happens only from time to time, he says. But actually, in his notebook, it was happening every day. And somehow the process, what he called the process, was going practically all the time. But I attempted to put into words the actual pain and sensation. So he did endure a considerable pain. This was something that people, even the great theosophical leaders, could not explain. If you lead a certain kind, it goes into that goes with a heightened consciousness. So it comes a sensation and a pain. It is not intended in a romantic way. If you lead a certain type of disciplined, quiet life, you realize a kind of energy. So this has to do with the way of life and with the release of a certain kind of energy. And he says that affects the non-mechanical part of your brain. So there is a non-mechanical part of the brain. He usually talked about the brain as a center of memory, center of mechanicalness, therefore. But suddenly, he says there is a non-mechanical part of the brain which is affected by this energy that is released by leading a certain kind of life. We don't know what kind of life. He says a disciplined, quiet life. Well, we'll see what kind of life he's intended that releases this energy. That's the question. This affects the non-mechanical part of your brain, so you enter into a new dimension. The mechanical is time-bound, and he says this is a timeless dimension. So the brain has also timeless dimension? These are a lot of questions that arise. The physical organism is incapable of meeting it. Meeting what? Meeting this energy, meeting this other dimension and its energy, and so it gets the pain. So it's just maybe too much for the body. He also talked about that this energy is beyond the energy of the body. And therefore the brain and the body itself have a hard time taking it. So there is a certain pain, but it's not, curiously enough, a pathological pain. The body feels it, but is not harmed by it. I'm not suggesting that everyone should try to attain this. Well, isn't he? The teachings are aimed at bringing about a certain quality of consciousness. So is this what is implied, what he went through, or it was peculiar to him and the kind of transformation that he has always been talking about and that we know is necessary for us as human beings to bring about a truly good humanity, world, and so on? Does it involve that, or can it be otherwise? So this is also will be a question that we will be attempting to address, but may be of interest to some people who have followed my thoughts and ideas to know what happens on a more personal level. Certainly, that was my case. It's still my case. I wanted to know what was happening to him on a more personal level. So that is the question of the process, therefore, arises. What is this process? What is this process? Now, there is no real definition. He just said something about it, right? This is energy. It releases a certain kind of life. This releases a certain kind of energy. And then you get the pain, but you also affects the non-mechanical part of the brain, and that gives access to a different dimension. In this other dimension is where the other, this sense of otherness, the sense of sacredness, this energy that would visit him on a daily basis would manifest. Now, the process has become an issue because if it's necessary to go through the process to bring about the transformation, then that may be complicated. Because it involves actually a lot of issues. What does it involve? You see, if it's just that, then we just have to say, by Krishnamurti's own statement, we just need to lead a certain kind of life. A disciplined, ordered kind of life. Right? Quiet life. We maybe try anyway ourselves, right?
Well, I think the image froze here, unfortunately. So let's hope that we can get Javier back here. Can you hear us, Javier? He probably logged out and will try to log back in.
Okay, am I on again?
Yes, now you're on again.
Sorry, I don't know what happened. He just went out. Sorry, I'm in Europe maybe or something. Anyway, I was talking about Mark Lee's. Mark Lee put a book together. If you're interested in this issue of the process, what Krishnamurti was going through, what it might imply, it's a peculiar phenomenon. As far as I know, it did not happen to any other great religious teacher. It seemed to be peculiar to him. There are cases in which pain was experienced. Even in Spain, we had Saint Teresa of Avila, who also had pain in certain states of contemplation. But it was nothing like this, nothing sustained, right? Because the whole thing began in 1922, but he was writing this notebook in 1961, and he was talking about it even later. The process continued throughout his life. Now, this is Mark Lee's book. I don't know, it shows it the right way. The Krishnamurti's process, Probing the Mystery. Basically, in it, Mark Lee just puts together the documentation that, the documents that exist, documenting this phenomenon. He includes the entries in the notebook there, but he includes the whole testimonials that were there at the beginning when the whole process began in 1922. Krishnamurti was just 27 years old, and he was in Ojai, California with his brother who was suffering from tuberculosis. And they went into this retreat, and Krishnamurti wanted to get back in touch with the masters. This was the whole thing with the Theosophical Society, and began to meditate on a regular basis to try and get in touch with the masters. That it was August 1922 in Ojai, California, nice climate, quiet place. They were up there in what is today the Krishnamurti Foundation of America, the center. And he started meditating for half an hour every morning. Now, we all know that from Krishnamurti that meditation should not be practiced, and should not be regular, and should not be anything. Go and live your life. But he did it regularly every morning. He was very disciplined, the old boy. He was much more disciplined than we would even want to imagine. Punctual in everything. And in fact, the whole process was extremely punctual, as we will see. So chronos, time by the watch, may have something to do with the unfolding of the timeless, I used to think. So there he is, the poor boy. He's experiencing with meditation. And what he's trying to do, he realizes very quickly, the guy was a genius, I'm afraid. So he looked like an idiot, but he was a genius of the inner world. In a matter of a couple of weeks, he began to discover where he had gone wrong. And he said, I've set out deliberately to correct the errors of the past. And pretty quickly, he was having all kinds of funny experiences. It began by him having a tremendous experience of non-duality, of watching this worker on the road and realizing, suddenly having the feeling that he was that man. He was his hammer. He was the stone he was working on. He was the tree, the bird, the blade of grass. He was everything, and everything was in him. This sense of totality suddenly emerges, and this experience he had any number of times. You can find it scattered throughout his writings. Mostly, for example, in his commentaries on living, he walks behind this woman in India and he disappears. He is the woman, and so on. So the sense of disappearance of his self was part of his inner freedom. He's already had it. The Theosophists had picked on him because they said, aha, this boy already doesn't have a strong sense of self, which is the separate, right? The notion of a separateness. So he already didn't have that. And when he deliberately sets out to discover whether he is really what they say he is, he finds that something is happening. He is indeed capable of having no division between him and that which is. So he keeps doing this, and on a few days later, on the 20th of August, he starts feeling sick, or a couple of days before, the day before, starts feeling sick, and he gets this pain at the back of his neck, and a knot at the back of his neck, like a huge ball, a little ball, like a large marble. And he's in pain like anything. The guy is in pain. And so they say to him, all right, go and sit down under this tree and calm down, because he used to, punctually at 6:30 in the evening, he would lose consciousness. And then they would start this pain. And he would start talking to these beings and so on, who, according to him, were working on him, were burning him. And he complained of terrible heat and of dirt and of, everything being wrong and so on and so forth, right? So for an hour or two, until 8:30, sometimes to 9:30, punctually every day, this process would be happening. Until they got him to sit under the pepper tree. This becomes mythological, right? It's like the Buddha under the peepal tree, right? Where he gets enlightened. So it's a bit of a picture like that. Okay, he would question that later, But this is the picture, that when he was sitting there, he got this vision of the immense, of that which was beyond. But something of a pattern was operating. And this is interesting, because he would sit at 6 o'clock and meditate for half an hour. In the evening it was, this time around. So he would meditate. We don't know. I don't know. Maybe somebody does know what kind of meditation he did. But he was meditating, deliberately setting out, as he said, to undo the mistaken turns of his past. I think if we were to do that, we would all find that we made quite a few wrong turns in our past. I wonder how you would set out deliberately to straighten all that, unless it was to dissolve the past. That was very interesting that he could do that, right? He always said later, meditation is not deliberate meditation. That's premeditation. Well, what did he do in Ojai? According to his own statements, he was deliberate about it. He set out deliberately to find out and dissolve those mistakes. So there he is, half an hour, he meditates, then he comes into the house and goes into an unconscious state. He disappears. According to his brother, he was no longer there. What was left of him was just this empty shell, this body that spoke occasionally with the voice of a 4-year-old. Now, is that a bit mad? Is that a bit strange? It's a very peculiar thing. Of course, I bet you that people who are more esoteric, and the Theosophists and so on they felt, well, yes, he's of course going out of his body, and he is meeting the great beings who are instructing him. And according to reports, what his brother wrote and others who were witnesses, he did speak in this. This was seemingly what was happening. There was this entity, what they call the physical elemental, the body elemental, the entity that governs the body, was this 4-year-old who was also having regression, a kind of experiencing a psychological regression back to childhood. Would talk about childhood. He was a great talker. And would talk about K, and would say to people around him, oh, stay with me until he comes back. So there was that sense of this entity was a different entity, right? The body and K. And K would go and K would come. And then when he would come back, he would restore consciousness, and then he would go to sleep. But while this was going on, there was enormous pain, enormous heat. His explanation was that they, because there were beings, according to him, carrying out this operation, were working on his consciousness so that it was purified. This is what it came up later, that he would say, well, just like you take a purgative to purify your body, this energy is a purgative for the brain. They're burning out all these psychological residues so that there is no trace of the personality left. Eventually, by 1930 or so, Krishnamurti was speaking like that he had lost almost all his personal memories. Sometimes David Bohm was a close associate of K. Sometimes used to say it was like, pulling the memories out of a computer. Sort of dislodging the memory sticks, the memory charges, right? Interestingly enough, so that this computer, that's a metaphor only, right? This mind could operate in a more intelligent fashion and not based on the mechanics of memory. So in fact, this was an operation happening from non-duality itself, was releasing this energy and emptying consciousness of its content. Now, if you remember, this was Krishnamurti's quintessential definition of the word meditation. The emptying of consciousness of its content. So this was a state of meditation. But it was happening in a state of what you might call unconsciousness. In the sense that he was not there. The conscious entity wasn't there. And yet there was an operation being carried physically on the brain, right? which was making it more empty, so that this quality of energy, of intelligence, would be coming through. He also said this: they're empty, they're burning me up, so that more of him. He talked in personalistic terms at the time, because they were talking about Maitreya and so on, the spirit coming through him. More of him can come. Later on, he took away all those symbols of divinity and so on. Just talked about energy, about intelligence, about the other, the otherness. One of the issues that is connected with the process is whether Krishnamurti awoke his Kundalini or not. Because the symptoms that were described corresponded to the awakening of Kundalini. The energy that, according to Hindu tradition, is coiled at the bottom of the spine, at the base of the spine, and which is released by in certain states of consciousness or through certain exercises, and goes up the spine and indeed breaks through the back of the neck and goes to the brain, splits into two, and comes together in the middle of the forehead, here between the eyes, above the nose, to open the third eye, which is the eye of wisdom. This is the tradition. Krishnamurti, in fact, described exactly this happening to him. And there are testimonies whereby he did say that he had awakened his Kundalini. So why did he do that? Because he felt that there was to be an energy needed to happen. He needed more energy to transcend the conditioning of the mind and to bring about the radical transformation. It was not the key necessarily to that transformation, but it was part of it. In fact, the release of energy, whichever way you do it is another matter, is fundamental, because it is the energy, the holistic quality of energy that's not coming from thought, that is not the energy of our mechanical mind, that needs to be released in order for that transformation to take place. For flipping over, if you like, the normal state of consciousness from its time-bound, self-centered operation to this timeless immensity of intelligence coming through. So this was the thing. Now, I have more to say, but I want to just round it up a little bit, because I think it would be best if we talk together versus that I give you a long lecture. It's always more creative, since we are human beings, and this is interesting to all of us. Just to round it up a little bit and not to go into too many details. Later on, you see, when his biography, the volume of his first biography came out in 1975. Again, when I was there at Brockwood and I bought it and I read it, it was very, very mysterious, the whole thing that had happened with Kay, because it was all wrapped up in this esoteric language of the Theosophists, who understood everything, apparently, concerning the structure of the spiritual world and the hierarchies of realized beings who had a plan for humanity, and there was an evolutionary plan for us, whereby human beings would go through a series of reincarnations. They took over Hinduism, Hindu ideas of reincarnation and karma and evolution, spiritual evolution, so that subsequent lives we would achieve higher levels of realization until, of course, we became totally free and were out of the round of life and death. This is very much in the whole spiritual tradition of India, right? Even Buddhism also has it. Hinduism and Buddhism have this inbuilt. This process of liberation, which Krishnamurti was also about, has this pattern. Now, Krishnamurti, of course, was on to liberation, right? And the sense of karma and liberation and so on, but he felt that that didn't work that way. That freedom came by another way. There was no progression necessary. No masters were even necessary. Right? What was necessary was a total facing of oneself, and that in the encounter with, for example, staying with suffering, the energy has to be released. It's a question of release of energy. It's not a question of belief. It's not a question of waiting for tomorrow. It's not a question of give me another life because I haven't been able to do it this time. I mean, I say that to myself, right? Give me another one because I'm not going to be able to do much this one, this time around. It's a very hopeful thing, right? So, all right, if we want hope, we have it. But he said, no, it's in this total radical facing of experience. Don't seek truth away from life. Life is truth. It's in the facing of experience, directly and deeply, whatever it is, if it's sorrow, pleasure, pain, violence, conflict, whichever it is, in his understanding, in staying with what is, that's the phrase he used later, there is the beginning of intelligence, because then there's no escape. We waste energy through escape. So the summation of energy, see, he defined religion as the summation of all energy in order to bring about this transformation. So for him, all that fits together. The element of religion as the gathering of all energy, but how do you gather the energy? By not wasting it. You don't gather it, you don't waste it. And you don't waste it, you meaning me, we don't waste it if we don't escape from the fact. So when Bohm questioned him about it, you see, when the biography came out, David Bohm, who was a scientist, was a bit mystified by all that account about his pain in the head and the process and his visions of these beings and all that stuff. So he said, well, what was happening? So basically, Krishnamurti admitted to having released his Kundalini. This is the way I read it. Others deny my assertion at the moment. So take that with a grain of salt. But as far as I'm concerned, Krishnamurti basically acknowledged that he had done that, but that was not necessary per se. Was maybe a significant aspect in his case, but it was not necessary for anyone else, because energy can be released in multiple ways. And one of the ways, many ways, is this. The fundamental way is stay with what is, don't waste energy in dualities. And for example, one of the major sources of energy, where energy is stored, is precisely in our suffering. If we, you and I, can, he said, stay totally with suffering, then that releases an enormous energy that is not the energy of thought. And he also told Bohm something else, which was, when you realize that desire is the source of the wastage of energy, and if the brain can stay without desire, that again releases that energy. So we didn't have to go through all that pain, hopefully, and all that stuff of the process, because the process, he said, was his own experimentation, the way I read it, his own experimentation, and he compared it to Columbus discovering America. He said, I found a truth, and I discovered it this way, but I now put it out across to you so that you can get to America much faster. So, well, I like that idea. But at the end of his life, as you know, he made a statement saying nobody has gotten to America since. Basically saying, all this energy has come through me, and I've told you about it and so on, but as far as I know, nobody else has done it. And so that's that. That was quite an interesting message to leave us with. But of course, he left us with our own reality, which was always his point, right? No hope, but also no despair. Just keep on learning and see what happens. Is that energy possible? Can we stop wasting energy? And is that the factor of liberation? Right? So that's the first chapter in my presentation, attempting to get to understand a little bit of the whole process that Krishnamurti was engaged in as a human being, and how this freedom or transformation may be possible, okay? So, I leave it there for today. You can ask any questions you like.
Well, one thing that seems to tie into this, Javier, is I came across an audio a little while ago. I can't remember where. I've got it around somewhere, but it was a conversation with Kay. I think it was in Malibu, and he had some friends, and they were at a house in Malibu, and they brought up, it might have been with Aldous Huxley. Anyways, they were talking about Kundalini, and he was saying that these people were asking him about, how there's people who are deliberately undertaking yoga practices to release or, raise this energy. And Kay's response to that is that it was really very foolish and dangerous, because the intimation was that, the structures in the mind, if they're not already dissolved, then when you force that energy, because I guess there's exercises, I don't know anything about it, but there's exercises you can do to actually, try to promote that release of Kundalini, and it lights up these, I guess defilements, or whatever you'd want to call it, in the psychic structure, and it can lead to insanity very easily, and a lot of tremendous psychological imbalances and so on. So I have a friend that went to India, and she was with this master there, and that was the whole thing they were doing, was they called it Kundalini Yoga, and they were deliberately trying to promote this arising of this energy. And he was very definite about how it really was not sound at all to engage in that kind of activity, and that it was actually very dangerous. So I just wanted to throw that in to the conversation.
Yeah, but anyway, Krishnamurti wasn't recommending doing Kundalini, so he did it himself apparently, but he wasn't recommending it to anybody, precisely because he felt there was a lot of nonsense around it, and a lot of, he felt it was not genuine, and he was appalled himself by what he saw. But of course, a genuine master of Kundalini will be appalled by others pretending to master something. Yeah.
Right.
He also felt that couldn't be really deliberately released, that it depended on a series of conditions, you see. But he had been experimenting with it. You see, there's a testimony by an Indian lady, Leena Sarabhai, who published she had met Krishnamurti in 1933-34, and she was staying at their parents' house in Bombay, and Mumbai, sorry, and he told them about she was an 18-year-old girl, and asked, what did you do? What was it like? And very innocently asked him questions, and he told her that he had in fact been trying to awaken his Kundalini for some 7 years. So the poor old boy had been busy with it, and suddenly, this is what the testimony says. There's always questions about how accurate the whole thing is. He said, as a result of my experiments over the last 6 or 7 years to awaken Kundalini, it was released from the chakra at the base of the spinal cord. I felt unbearable pain. One day in Vienna, I fainted 17 times. So he was fainting. It was too much, you see, for the body, all this energy that was released. So he did that, but he didn't feel that was absolutely necessary for everyone to do, because the energy the gathering of energy is what matters, and not what this particular energy. It has to be an energy of another order, an energy that does not come from a source of division and friction, from the mechanical part of the brain. So whatever way that energy is to be released, Yeah, I prefer some other way, personally, to lead a life. If we can lead a life, you see, that's why I think his teachings moved away. Don't you have this question also for yourselves in our inquiry or encounter with K, that his origins, his beginnings are very esoteric, but he seems to move away from the esoteric. His teachings kind of don't touch on the esoteric. They only mention it as a kind of potential development if we do something to bring about a heightened state of sensitivity, which is what those states were. Extremely heightened states of sensitivity. Though it's a simple word, does not involve any kind of transcendental associations with any hidden hierarchies or anything. Those may exist, but he said it doesn't matter if the masters exist or don't exist. What matters is, are you doing your work? Are you freeing yourself from conditioning, from all these factors that bring about conflict, division, and the wastage of energy? If you are doing that, then you can seek all the masters you like, and nothing will happen. You see, he made a little joke once. I thought it was a joke, maybe it wasn't, which is that, look, when you yourself are in such a state of total order, you don't have to look for the sacred. The sacred comes running after you. So I thought that was really quite funny. And that seemed to be happening with him. You see, he was just every day being visited by this powerful energy, which others who were with him could feel, and which his body had to endure. Imagine what our body is. We can hardly endure a little pain from the bite of a bee. But he was being flooded, according to his own account and those who were with him, by this powerful energy, which, of course, caused this pain in his system. I can imagine that when you put a lot of, if you like, power, a lot of volume, he sometimes in his notebook, he has this image of seeing a huge channel of granite stone going right into the heaven, and down which came this huge volume of water. So that's how I think that somehow the body has to be a huge channel itself, or the brain, that emptiness of the brain has to be big enough, has to be huge, just as huge, to be able to allow that torrent to pass through it. And I can imagine that I'm not sure that any brain, even Krishnamurti's emptiness and immensity, was big enough. Because we're still human. There's still an element of the smallness of the creature at the end of the day. That's my feeling. So I can imagine that a lot of pain could just simply come from there, from this tremendous thing. Doesn't it happen to us sometimes that if you suddenly have a moment of beauty, of real beauty, your heart aches, because the heart has been too small to really endure, to really, how you say, not encompass, but embrace that immensity of beauty. But it's a different kind of pain. It's not the pain of the bee stinging or of a hurt. It's the pain of that encounter of the limited with an unlimited element. That's how I think of it sometimes.
Yeah, I'd have to agree with you. Yeah, that's how it seems. Yeah.
Another detail maybe that might be interesting just to share is that in his last statement, I was surprised when I first read it. Came out in the last volume of Krishnamurti's biography. Where is it? K wasn't talking about the mind. He was talking about the body, which is very peculiar, right? Wait a minute, I'll have to find it, huh? Give me a second. Yes. Well, takes a while to find the organization. I read only the one part. See, well, I can read the whole thing. You can see where he was at. This was in response, as you may remember, to a question that was posed to him by one of the trustees, Mary Cadogan, when he was in his deathbed. He had very few days to go. So she asked him, when Krishnamurti dies, Krishnaji dies, what really happens to that extraordinary focus of understanding and energy that is K? So he called for a tape recorder. He wanted to leave a record of this. So that was interesting as well. He wanted it known, and this is the transcription. He said, I was telling them this morning, for 70 years, that super energy, no, that immense energy, immense intelligence, has been using this body. Has been using this body. I don't think people realize what tremendous energy and intelligence went through this body. There is a 12-cylinder engine. 12-cylinder engine. I don't know if there are higher cylinder engines now. He used to love cars, and a 12-cylinder was very high. And for 70 years was a pretty long time. And now the body can't stand anymore. Nobody can understand what went through this body. Nobody. Don't anybody pretend. Nobody. I repeat this. Nobody amongst us or the public knows what went on. I know they don't. And now, after 70 years, it has come to an end. Not that intelligence and energy, it's somewhat here, every day, and especially at night. And after 70 years, the body can't stand it. Can't stand anymore. It can't. The Indians have a lot of damned superstitions about this, that you will and the body goes and all that kind of nonsense. You won't find another body like this, or that supreme intelligence operating in a body for many 100 years. You won't see it again. When it goes, it goes. There is no consciousness left behind of that consciousness, of that state. They'll all pretend or try to imagine they can get into touch with that. Perhaps they will, somewhat, if they live the teachings. But nobody has done it. Nobody. And so, that's that. Now, as a last parting message to mankind, that left us in a pickle. You won't find another body. We don't know. You won't find another body like this, or that supreme intelligence operating in a body for many 100 years. We don't know. I don't know with what certainty he could say that. But he felt that it was a special body. That's what I mean. Somehow the emphasis on the body was very, very interesting. And he said they have worked on this body for hundreds of years. Who worked? Now, partly it's culture. The Hindu culture, in particular, has worked on the body. Maybe that's also a point to bear in mind, that the cultures can also work on the body to sensitize it as a whole. I'll tell you an anecdote. When I went to Brooklyn for the first time as a student, there was a girl came from Rishi Valley to dance I think it was Aditi Mangaldas, came to Brookwood, and she was dancing in the living room, just a nice little dance moment there. And I realized something. At least the classical Indian dance was not like the Western classical dance. The Western classical dance is athletic. We tell a story by action in space and interaction with others, whereby some kind of drama is worked out. She was alone, of course, not with others, so that may have been a different also. But that the Indian dance was centered on that body itself, becoming a channel of a quality of beauty and order that wasn't of its own. It wasn't even in the space. They were just gestures and movements to sensitize that body as an appeal to the inner. So this could also have to do with it. That has to do with culture. Partly. He never accepted that as a full answer at all. He didn't know the answer at the end of the day either, to the mystery that was his own being, right? But you can say that each culture gets, in some regards, what it cultivates. If you cultivate sensitivity to the inner, you are likely to get great teachers. If you cultivate scientific precision and insight, then you will get great scientists. So I'm saying that is not to be underestimated, that the culture has a lot to do with it, right? And of course the Hindu culture has for millennia drawn attention to the body as an extraordinary instrument of capable of the most profound sensitivity. And if that body happens to lack a self, then it has no stoppage already to that energy of intelligence flowing through it, right? That's part of the whole religious culture that has informed that subcontinent for ages. So that's one. But he said, no, it's not that. He dismissed all kinds of hypotheses. He said, well, that could be, maybe there's something to it. The Indian body has that sensitivity. But he never thought, I'm an Indian, and that's why I'm this. He dismissed being that, right? The teachers don't belong anywhere. Anyway, they're great teachers. They're universal in nature. But the body, the quality of sensitivity, what bodies do we cultivate? But that also means what kind of minds do we cultivate? What orientation we give our minds? What values we uphold? Because that's part of that earlier element of, he said, if you lead a certain kind of disciplined, quiet life, then that energy is also produced. It's part of it. The orderly, the right state of values. See? We'll look at that later. We'll look at that in subsequent tomorrow in the regard of what kind of life he's contemplating in his notebook that is conducive to this quality of order. What kind of values is he bringing through? What kind of insights? Because he has that element of, you have to lay the ground of order if there's going to be this breakthrough. So what does it mean, laying the ground of order? Right? So we'll look at that later. But there you are. There is nobody has understood. When he goes, it goes. Perhaps they will somewhat if they live the teachings. I thought that was very nice. He kind of opened the window a crack, left a little crack, just opened there. He says, all right, live the teachings and maybe...
Javier, I want to ask you something personal. You have studied this so intensely. What does it mean for you personally, if you all this?
Personally, what does it mean to me? Look, it's part of the exploration of human transformation. So for me, what it means is the discovery of new aspects of that transformation. For example, the quality of energy, I normally wouldn't pay much attention to it. And suddenly, it brings it across in a much more intense way. Look, let me be more personal even. I want to be personal. You see, the Krishnamurti does propose a journey of inward self-discovery and self-knowledge, in which the possibility of this freedom and this wholeness is implied. So that I've been on that quest, that study, if you like, for a long time. That's why I went to Brockwood. That's why I continue to work with Krishnamurti's teachings. And I've had made my little discoveries, like you all have, I'm sure. The sense of those moments of insight, those moments of awakening to one, the truth that is there, or the being that is there, the perception of something immense, but also the corresponding insight into oneself that is liberating from those factors of conditioning that constitute the ground of conflict and the ground of enduring misery. So all that learning process, this is what it all means to me, this quality of learning process. And of course, the mystical side, it's all a bit remote in that regard. So even to approach it is a delicate issue, right? Because those breakthroughs into another dimension that he's talking about on a regular basis were few and far between for me. But still, he's insisting that it is important to become aware of it and all the factors involved in terms of bringing about that quality of wholeness and freedom in us. So that's what it means. It means the ongoing inquiry into that and to see whether a deeper understanding is possible. And you see, he also put an emphasis, which I found interesting, that when he poses a question, then it awakens something in us of the deeper intention that we have in relation to changing our lives and finding that freedom and wholeness. So that also, the contact with him keeps echoing, and with the teachings keeps echoing and bringing about this resonance into the deeper layers of intent in my life.
Yeah.
I should ask you, what does it mean to you?
No, I'm not.
because not to send the ball back, okay? but just because we are holding a conversation, right?
No, I was wondering also that this is also very, you were talking about that cultural influence, and maybe in our culture in the West, I thought maybe all those psychotherapeutic approaches are more the way we try to clean up ourselves, to go through traumatic experience and to liberate ourselves. And maybe that's our
way.
Our way.
Our purgation.
Yeah. Now, there are some, because there are some similarities in that, certainly. And to go through all those things. And that I know, of course, by experience too, that one can free oneself from certain very strong emotional reactions and patterns, etc. Yeah. Okay, nice.
Can I ask?
You have a comment?
Yeah, just a question. Javier brought up in his initial description of what Krishnamurti was going through, suffering. So could you just talk a little bit more about that, how that helped him, or that was part of the process and beneficial?
Well, I'm not sure how I brought it in, because it was unclear what he was suffering from.
not well.
Yeah, but go ahead.
Not physically. I
Yes,
guess
yes.
physically, but yeah, part of the process more when you go through it, there's an element of
Yes. There's an element of pain. He had to endure enormous pain. See, this is a question, because he said, if you face suffering and you stay totally with it, and that releases that energy. So actually, Bohm, I recommend very much, Eric, let me see if I find this reference here. I think you would be interested to read through it, or I think now it's also, you can listen to the whole audio recording. It's of a conversation between Krishnamurti and David Bohm. Where is it? I should have my reference more readily at hand. Aha, here it is.
thank you for looking.
No, because I think this is fascinating stuff, at least for me. It raises a lot of questions and answers a few. And there was a dialogue, a dialogue between Kay and David Bohm. And I give you the date because you can find it in the official Krishnamurti channel. Yes, all the audios are there of Krishnamurti in dialogue with David Bohm, and especially with David Bohm, they put all the Bohm things. This is dated, and it's Brookwood Park, the 28th of June, 1975. 28th of June, 1975.
Got it. Thank you.
Yeah, and that's where Bohm brings up the question of the biography, of the first volume of the biography, and questions Kay about it. I found it confusing, but at least these questions are posed, because Kay said, this liberation and transformation, the energy is released through suffering. So Bohm says, what were you suffering from then? Right? And I actually found that Kay kind of, how you call it, avoids a direct answer, because he said, well, what causes suffering is attachment, right? He said, Kay was saying, well, I think the transformation had to do with that. And he mentioned, of course, the critical event in his life, which was the death of his brother. When his brother Nitya died, it was 1975, so it was already 3 years after the whole thing had begun to unravel, high, right? The whole thing. So his brother dies, and he goes into a total depression. That's the description that is made. He breaks down, the good old boy. At the same time, the whole theosophical structure, hyperstructure of the spiritual world also begins to collapse, because he is not agreeing with what they are doing. So both worlds, his own personal world of his brother, who was a life support for him in some regards, quite close, always closely bound together, and the whole theosophical structure in which he believed still at the time, begin to collapse. But he says, facing the actuality of death frees him from the reality of thought. It's an extraordinary sentence. Facing the actuality of death, which was the suffering of his brother dying, freed him from the reality of thought. Look, that very sentence, I think, is to be meditated upon for a while, to hold close to one's heart and say how the reality of death, even to face, what does it mean to face the reality of death? So his sense was that he did suffer, but it wasn't attachment or something, but that meeting the reality of death was what freed him from the reality of thought. So the liberation inwardly, even though something was already happening, was in the act of meeting death itself. It's mysterious still, huh? Beautiful, poetic, radical. What would happen? That's the question also. You see, most of us suffer from a fear of death. Death, we perceive it as suffering because it denies what we hold most dear. To begin with, ourselves. We're going to die. And to meet, what does it mean to meet the reality? That means to die in some real sense. So I think what he came upon was the sense of his own death, not just his brother, but his own death. But what that means is the ending of thought. So the guy underwent something very radical at that point. And he felt that the freeing from the reality of thought by facing the actuality of death was the awakening, was actually the ending of suffering and the beginning of compassion. So the suffering is in thought, is in being in the world of thought. The ending of thought is death. And that is the release of the energy of the suffering, which is compassion. Now, this is sounds like alchemy. This is a magical transformation at levels of reality, inner reality, that most of us seldom even touch. So he's appealing to something very profound, to say this energy can be released by facing the actuality of death, which is the ending of thought. Sometimes when I read him and then I say, well, do I even begin to understand the real depth, even the actuality of what he's saying? Even the intellect can't hold together. It begins to splinter.
Yeah.
like a piece of ice that is hit by a hammer, you see. It's sort of, boom, it can't hold it. It holds as a sentence on a piece of paper, but it doesn't hold as a truth in the mind because thought is not able to encapsulate it. It has to go somewhere else to meet the actuality of death.
Can I ask you what you mean when you, we've kind of determined in our Krishnamurti group that thought equals conditioning.
Uh-huh.
So what do you mean when you say ending of thought completely?
I'm quoting somebody, huh?
I see.
No, I don't want to wash my hands of my responsibility, but would be also easy. But no, wait. I don't say ending of thought totally, right? This is a question of the place of thought and the relevance of thought. That dialogue with Bohm and Kay is from a series which was entitled basically Truth and Actuality. Those dialogues have not been published in their entirety. They've been published in little sections. So I recommend those of you who are interested, go and listen to the actual audios, because that's where they are complete. The whole discussions are complete, not partial as they were published, fragmentary as they were published. But there, you see, the aspect of what is thought, what is his relation to truth, and what is his relationship to actuality. Kay, you see, suddenly these two big heads, Bohm and Kay, start talking about three domains of being. There is reality, which is the field of thought, what you can think about. There's actuality, which is everything that's happening in active. And there is truth, which Kay puts beyond everything. But Kay always said, look, the known, which is the field of thought, and the unknown have never met and will never meet. Now that's a crack in the universe. If we're talking about wholeness, our mind instantly rejects such cracks. And especially Bohm, who was a scientist, he had a problem with such a crack. Because if his thought cannot at all access that intelligence, then he's stuck, you see. We're stuck as scientists. We have to acknowledge an irreducible limitation in the understanding of truth. So what does they do? He pushes Kay. He says, look, the reality, you can look at it as a function within the field of actuality. So it's a functional aspect. It's an instrument. It's not a totality that we can see. Thought is partial. It's just an aspect. It's mostly based on memory. But it's actually a much subtler instrument, perhaps. And when the brain itself is in order, when it is not prey to its own self-deceptions and illusions, thought can respond to intelligence. So there's a one-way connection from intelligence to thought. Thought can respond to intelligence. So the good old boy K had to go that far to acknowledging a connection between truth, which is the operation of intelligence, and thought in the field of actuality, but he has his conditions. And the condition is that we be free from self-deception, from thought believing that it is what it isn't. That's the trick. That's the enterprise we are on, to see if we can understand the nature of the psyche, so that there can be the freedom from those self-deceptions. That thought, in its own, or the consciousness in its own self-misunderstanding, has created for itself. So the ending of thought is this one, this illusory aspect of thought that creates its own false reality, and therefore falsifies the nature of consciousness and prevents the emergence of truth. That's an extraordinary power of thought, that it can prevent the action of truth by creating illusions. So we had to appeal again to self-knowledge and intelligence to dissolve those illusions, curiously enough. That's why there is no way to do it, because it has to be an act of insight. And yet we must work at it just as relentlessly, without hope.
Thank you.
Well,
Ashraf, you've been waiting for a while patiently. Go ahead. You raised your hand.
Yeah. Thank you. I'm looking forward to listening to this. I was multitasking. I was actually working. So I wanted to ask you about, you mentioned something about esotericism, esoteric, and you said something that Krishnamurti did not believe in or did not align with that esoteric something. I missed something in it, and I'd be interested in knowing that. And secondly, perhaps this is my own conditioning, but I was indoctrinated in a Sufi tradition, and we were quite a bit encouraged not to talk about these states of higher states of consciousness or sensitivities or any of that. And then I was affiliated with a school, a Vedantic school, an Advaita school, where we were encouraged to talk about these things. And perhaps, and I think Krishnamurti spoke about skepticism. And I'm not a skeptic, I'm actually want to hear, and this is Krishnamurti's experiences when you're talking about it, something in me wants to hear it. And there is a little bit of skepticism coming up for me. I don't know what that is. Perhaps it's my own conditioning, because I don't like when you first started the talk, you mentioned that we've all had some kind of not an insight, but some kind of a gift of seeing this non-dualism, and to put it in words sometimes, or to make an account of it and then speak about it to someone, or to even oneself, something is lost. And I'm just wondering what you have to say if when one has these experiences, whatever you want to call it, higher states of consciousness or a different state, and not to be attached to it, but just not to speak about it, or even if one has to speak about it, what is? I'm just questioning the authenticity or the accuracy of it. I don't know if that would be my question.
It's quite a question. I mean, should one talk about these things? Krishnamurti would say the word is not the thing to begin with, right? So the description is not the described. Therefore, whatever he's saying about these states and all this, he talks and names it and uses words. But he says, just bear in mind that I have to use words in order to communicate something. But as a matter of fact, those things, in fact, at that level, at that dimension, they're not describable by words. So he was, he hesitated for a very long time, I think, to talk about these things. That's why he didn't write anything like this, I think, before or after. This is one unique document, the notebook, where he dared to say and to share with that. But you see, my own feeling is, when you look at all these religious traditions, and particularly in the Eastern world, you have, for example, the Taoists. You see, the Tao that can be named is not the Tao. And therefore, that of which you cannot speak, you better be silent. But there is a beauty to that also. But at the same time, it seems to me that, particularly here in the West, as I see it, we have practically banished the sacred from our world. I'm talking, maybe here is more specific to us, in which religion, we have basically shoved it aside because science has taken over, and also religion has degenerated into dogmatism. It hasn't kept up its inquiry like it should. It's become dogmatic instead of the skeptical aspect of discovery, the questioning, which it had in the beginning, but which then became dogmatic, and then because it held on to belief, which was undermined by science, it was then pushed aside. So we are now in so-called secular society in the West, but what that is leaving out a lot, and what tends to deny, is the whole inner dimension, apart from the psychological, which Marina was pointing out, our search into the psyche. It also almost practically denies any kind of transcendental dimension to our lives. We are functional entities. And in fact, the psychology is mostly having to do with solving issues of malfunction. So we have to just create proper function. There is not, I don't know, there is all kinds of psychologies, by the way, in transpersonal and all that developing now. So we have a bit more of a spiritual element to it, but generally it's concentrated on adjusting, resolving issues that arise in the functioning of consciousness. There is no question even in the general tradition of asking whether thought itself is part of the issue. There is no questioning about, can thought end? Or is there an end to fear? Or is there an end to sorrow? That kind of fundamental drastic questioning is not there. And most people, even in the West, most kids, have some kind of transcendental experience in the sense of, I'm not using it any associations with that, just the sense of coming upon an immensity, a sense of presence that goes beyond thought. That's part of our human makeup. But the society itself apparently has no space in which that can even be mentioned, can be made part of the cultural conversation. I know it. My own daughter has had an experience. I cannot talk to anybody about it. You are the only guy I can talk to about this. Nobody else. And then she talked to another friend, and the other friend also had it. And probably there are any number of her friends who also have it. And it turns out that these things are pointing to something of the most fundamental nature, of the most significant aspect of our existence, and the culture blots it out. That's why I think it's important to talk about it, to bring the relevance of it as it actually is experienced by people, so that that value is not lost sight of, because in my view is the more universal aspect of our being. It's part of the undermining, dissolving of this continuous self-centered emphasis and of the lack of respect that goes on in relation to one another. Because if the other has touched the sacred or has been touched by it, you can't help but respect them. Mm-hmm. So to me, you see, just at that little level, very basic level, I'm not talking about anybody becoming a saint or anything. Yeah. Just the fact that our consciousness has this potential Krishnamurti used to say this, many children have it, and you can see it in the way they are. Why do they lose it? So that's a question for most of us. Why did we lose it? We had it, and then we lost it. And part of it is the culture. So we also have a responsibility in terms of transforming the culture, in terms of what is relevant and valuable in it, I feel. But yes, careful with talking about that stuff. People also make something of themselves because they've had experiences. You see, so the self can nourish itself on anything. Oh, I'm more spiritual than you because I had 10 and you had 5. What? It's absurd. You see, we get into absurdities of that kind of nature. That's not the point. The point is, we as human beings are born, as far as I'm concerned, with that potentiality for embodying or being in contact with something that is immensely good, with what Krishnamurti called the reservoir of goodness, right? And our responsibility is, as mankind, not yours and mine only, as mankind, to see whether that can be tapped. Why wouldn't we talk about it? Well, that's my thing.
And
That's
my understanding, or at least when you said about esoteric, and that he did not speak about it, or he didn't believe, I missed something because as I was working on something else at the same time. I'm esoteric for myself means that that is what is hidden and needs to be uncovered. But I don't know. Could you say something about that? Because I'm interested in knowing what it's referring to.
right. Well, I'm not sure what I said, but I think the main thing when I was in conversation with some people the other day, and this issue came up, you see, of the early Krishnamurti, as he was brought up by the Theosophical Society. Everything was very esoteric, in the sense of, and it does mean hidden, right? It comes from the word hidden, the discovering of that which is hidden, and particularly at the spiritual dimension. So that's the esotericism, the search for that. That's the mystical endeavor and all that. So he talked about that. You see, the other beings, the realized beings, there being a hierarchy, there being a whole process to undergo, process different from what we use now, a whole structure of development and so on. But later on, this is what I mean, that he didn't deny it, but he felt it was not relevant, that there was a different way in which we can be spiritual. See, spirituality usually means relating to some divine entity that is outside you and which a certain system of belief embodies or describes and offers you a way to access. But he said, no, the way of access and the way of spirituality is through your own life. Whether those beings exist or not is irrelevant. Mm-hmm. What is relevant? This is radical. What a teacher. I mean, he denies the whole thing. Brushes the masters, brushes everybody. He said, I don't deny their existence or they are not their existence. But it's irrelevant. What's relevant is whether you as a human being can be true, can be free, can be whole. You do that work, and then maybe if there is anything there to be discovered, it will come of its own accord. Right? Mm-hmm. So I personally find that liberating, in that it takes away from a whole structure of conformity, of conceptual structure, which is the traditional way of the spiritual world, right?
Yeah.
So they know, and that also makes it that we are directed at some conceptual dimension, and we don't pay attention, which is what this is about, to what we actually are, do, feel, etc. So this quality of direct attention to our own being, for Krishnamurti, as far as I understand him, is the way of spirituality. And it means not avoiding anything that is manifesting, neither pain, nor pleasure, nor fear, nor anything. Everything is to be understood comprehended in an act of awareness and intelligence. And that starts clearing the field. And that clarity is what empties consciousness of its content and what opens that space to the energy that connects with intelligence. I like that picture myself. Of course, it's just a picture, right? We have to experiment. And I think that is the invitation from Krishnamurti to say, pay attention to just the simplest of things. How you sit, how you talk, how you walk, how you eat, how you think, how you feel. What is it that your relationships, what do they manifest about your conditioning? Is there in that awareness a dissolving of the center of the me? I find that very beautiful. And he brings it home. This is the thing also. Brings it home. Of course, he makes it all very responsible and very vulnerable, right? But that's where we need to be.
Mm.
This is a wonderful ending point, it seems to me, for today's session. There's a lot that could be more that could be inquired into and explored. But yeah, to bring it down into the daily life and what we can do and are able to do is important to keep in mind. And perhaps that's what we can most focus on and at this point. So we'll see you again tomorrow.
Yes, you have 24 hours to become aware.
Right.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
We'll see you tomorrow. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.